My name is Katy Curtis. I am the Education Outreach Manager for the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum. And I'm delighted that we get to spend every second Monday with the Senior Center doing this wonderful program that is called Bainbridge Remembers Oral Histories. And it's to share stories of Bainbridge Islanders. So before we get started today, I do want to acknowledge that we are on Suquamish land, and I want to read the land acknowledgement statement. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is within the Aboriginal territory of the Suquamish, people of the clear salt water. Ex-fishermen, canoe builders, basket weavers, the Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish people live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. And I was thinking about what I had heard from a friend of mine, Barbara Lawrence, who is Suquamish, and she was saying that during the winter time is when the Suquamish people would gather in the longhouse, and it was like 800 feet long across the water from Bainbridge Island. And one of the things that we like to share at the Historical Museum is that although some people say that the Suquamish have villages that they were here temporarily during the year, they actually had villages throughout the year. It's just that I was thinking of it in my cultural background as if winter was the time of when they get education and tell stories. So that's where we are right now. So I want to introduce to you a new friend of mine. Her name is Sharon Rutzick, and she's going to introduce herself, how long she's been on the island, and some things about herself. But today we're going to hear her share her family traditions that are different than Santa Claus, different than gift giving. And then I would love to hear maybe some other people share their traditions as well, so that we can get the diversity of traditions that happen on Bainbridge Island. So Sharon, will you please tell us a little bit about yourself, and welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Katy. It's been wonderful meeting you, excuse me, and getting to learn about these oral history sessions at the Senior Center, and to Carolyn Hart, who has been so much fun to work with and help me because my technology skills are sadly lacking. Katy asked me to talk about how we got here and then to talk about Hanukkah. And before I start, so I remember, I'm going to turn my iPad so you can see the setup, and I hope you can see it. It's a selection of our family's Hanukkah Menorahs and these small tops that we play with during Hanukkah. And I wanted to talk about Hanukkah, what our family does, but I also wanted to talk about what Hanukkah is, for those of you who may not know what it is and where it was in history. So how we got here, well, our family has been here since 1980. And we moved here from Rhode Island, where we had been living for about 6 years. And my husband was working for Rhode Island Legal Services, which is a federally funded program. It's a poverty program that provides lawyers for indigent clients, and it's all over the country. And we had met at Berkeley in the 60s and always wanted to come back to the West Coast. So after 6 years in Rhode Island and a number of years on the East Coast, we said, this is the time. So Bill flew out here, and he drove from Seattle down to San Diego and stopped at each legal services office just to see what they were like and who might have openings then or coming up. And when he got home, he got an offer from Portland, and we were going to take it. And that's when Mount St. Helens erupted, and the news was that was going to keep happening. and we had 4 young
Wow.
kids, and he said those fumes and ash was going to keep spewing over Portland. So we thought, oh, maybe we should wait. And then he got an offer from Seattle, and we were thrilled, and we came to Seattle. Took us a week in a $400 clunker with our 4 kids and 2 dogs, and of course arrived in the rain. This was in October, but the next day the sun was glorious, and my husband had found a place for us to rent on the Rolling Bay Boardwalk, and there was a clear view of Mount Baker, beautiful sunrises. Our neighbors had primroses that bloomed the entire winter, where I was used to 5 feet of snow. And everywhere I drove on the island, it was beautiful. And people here were so interesting. The schools were a big improvement from my kids' schools in Rhode Island. And I loved it. I just felt completely in love. And my only reservation was that growing up in Indiana and then in California, I'd only been the only Jewish family in my kids' school, in my school in Indiana, and then in California, just one of a few Jewish families. And I did not want my kids to be raised in that situation, because it was very difficult. So that bothered me, because I loved it here so much. Then as December was coming, I knew there was a Jewish bookstore in Seattle, and I went in at the beginning of December just to find some gifts and maybe decorations. And when I was leaving, I gave the cashier my check, and he said, "Oh, that's so funny, you're from Bainbridge Island." He said, "A woman was just in from Bainbridge, and she knew a couple of other Jewish families on the island, and she's going to be having a Hanukkah party. And she told me if anybody comes into the bookstore, give them her phone number, and she'd love to have you." So that's what I
love
did.
this. This is so great. Oh my gosh.
It was totally kismet, I guess. And I knew I had met by then one other family in my oldest daughter's class. So they came too. And when I walked in the door, there was a very pregnant woman who I think is here today, flipping potato pancakes on the stove. And turned out she and her husband had also moved to the Seattle area from Berkeley. And as it turned out, that evening, there were 17 families there, and most of them thought they were the only Jewish family on Bainbridge. We were all young, raising young kids, except one elderly couple. And she was a writer, and at the end of the evening, we decided to stay in touch. And she started writing a newsletter for the group, and we started meeting together to celebrate Sabbath, and the following spring Passover, and the next year the high holidays. And within a while we had a school, and we continued meeting, and it was wonderful, because all of us were, I think, had strong positive feelings about being Jewish, but had not really wanted to worship in conventional ways, the ways we had been raised. And if we had wanted that, we probably would have chosen to live in Seattle, where there was a lot of choices of, conventional synagogues. But here we had to make our way, and we did it by creating our own services, drawing on lots of Jewish traditions, and lay-led, occasionally having rabbis come over. And as time went on, more Jewish families did move to the island, and a number of them did want a more traditional way of services and a traditional community. So you will see now on Miller Road a small synagogue just down the road from Bainbridge Gardens. But we've continued, a number of us, meeting in homes, still lay-led. About 20 years ago, we were able to receive a Torah on loan from an organization in England. A Torah is a parchment scroll that's handwritten in Hebrew, and it's the entire Bible, and it's read at services throughout the year. And this Torah is about 150 years old, and it comes from a synagogue in Prague. It was rescued from the Holocaust. And as it turns out, it was a synagogue that my father had attended sometimes when he lived in Prague. So it was a wonderful addition to our community. And we have had lasting friendships and a wonderful way of learning and worshiping together. So I've been very grateful, and that allowed us to stay on Bainbridge, those connections. But I will say that having young children in school in the 80s here was still not so easy as Christmas approached, because everything was Christmas. All academic stuff pretty much ceased. And I had been raised by parents who felt very strongly that there should be a strong separation of church and state. And I felt the same way. So I would have rather that there hadn't been either Hanukkah or Christmas celebrations in school. So when teachers asked me to come in and talk about Hanukkah, I was always torn, because in school you want children to have their universe expanded and learn about other peoples and other traditions. Nevertheless, I didn't feel that religious traditions had a place in school, so I would end up going in, but I was kind of torn about that. And
Sure.
as Christmas approached, that's all there was all day in school, every day, it seemed. And so finally, our family, just somewhere towards the beginning of the week, just started celebrating the vacation early. And then with dear friends, we would sometimes just pick up and go to the coast with a bunch of food and our menorahs and celebrate Hanukkah there, away from all the festivities here. And we would also celebrate with our community and also with friends at home. But that was a way of trying to minimize both commercialism and the stress that it could put on our children. So anyway,
Yeah.
as to
I was just wondering, I just had two little questions. They're big, but so did you say you'd go, where would you go together? And I heard you say you'd go to the beach.
to the coast. I don't remember the name of the town, but I remember Oysterville.
Okay.
Where the kids would climb the huge mound of oysters, and it was always gray and overcast, but the beach was wide and beautiful, and we'd cook up a storm and play games, and was wonderful. And those friends are here today, I think, at this meeting. So anytime they want to chime in, I would love that.
Yeah, they could chime in the chat or chime in a little later. And then the other thing is, just as a historian, where does that Torah live? Like, it must be kept in a special kind of way?
Yeah, it is. We, some wonderful woodworkers, two men and their wives, crafted a beautiful ark that holds it. And the ark's design is based on the windows of the synagogue in Prague that the Torah comes from. It's very simple. It's a yellow maple or oak, I'm not sure. And it's very simple, but it's very beautiful. And it did get a little bit damaged once. And so another friend whose sons were musicians said, why don't you have musical cases made for them with wheels so we could transport it? So they look like we're transporting a huge tuba or something. We have the ark and the Torah in separate cases, and we bring them, and they're in a home. And yeah.
So I can kind of feel how it might have been overwhelmingly Christmas, because one of the things that I love is walking down Winslow Way, and there's all of these beautiful lights and everything like that. And so it sounded like you carved out a place for yourselves. And were there people who weren't used to, like I hear you went to the schools and shared some of that, but did you have any friends that were like, for example, John Garfunkel is a friend of mine, and one of our favorite things to do is to go to Passover at his house, even though we're not Jewish, right?
Yeah.
So did you have any people like that that were kind of like added into your traditions?
Sure. Friends often come to things. Yeah. That's not unusual at all.
Feels very like an inclusive thing, even though I didn't know about Jewish celebrations and things.
Yeah.
So
Well,
wondering,
we hope that. And actually, a number of the families on the island and in our group are, marriages between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person. So there's a lot of sharing, and we want people to feel at ease.
mm-hmm. Well, I see that Nina said that those were beautiful times at the beach. And so, Nina and Stephen, do you want to tell a brief description of your beach time? I'm just going to see if they unmute or not. Okay, you guys, you can break in if you want. So I wanted to know, did you have any other stories about the actual tradition of things that your family does?
I did. I wanted to talk a little bit first about what Hanukkah was, just so people know what it is, and then talk about the traditions, if that's okay. It's actually celebrating a military victory from the year 164 BC. And for myself, celebrating a military victory isn't like an incredibly wonderful thing, but it was significant for a short while in Jewish history. You can see on a map where Israel is. It's a tiny place, but it's right on the Mediterranean. It's on the way to Turkey in the north and to Saudi Arabia in the south now. And so it was kind of a crossroads. And it was while the Jews had started coming there from slavery in Egypt, maybe 1,300 years before this military victory, the country was repeatedly overrun and ruled by other peoples like Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Turks, a number of different groups. So and the Jews in the land of Israel were often taken out as slaves during periods. So this was during a period when Jews were back in the land of Israel, but Rome was the predominant force. And while Rome itself was not occupying Israel, its Syrian, I don't know what you would call it, a Syrian associate, was collaborated with Rome. And he had found that people did best under Roman rule if they were willing to give up things about their culture in return for Roman citizenship. And one of those important things was their religion. He thought it was a fair trade-off because Rome would kind of leave you alone. But most of the Jews in the land of Israel didn't think it was a fair trade-off. And he noticed that the Jewish celebrations begin at night. It's a lunar calendar. And so Jews, they sometimes pray at night. They had at that time people reading services to them from a scroll or from a book, and they met in a congregation. They blessed wine. They circumcised the boys. They had a number of traditions that just were not going to be acceptable to the Romans, and the most important one was that they worshiped one God. So he said, that's going to have to go. And some people were attracted to the Roman traditions, Roman Syrian traditions, but a number of Jews were not. And in an area north of Jerusalem, in a mountainous area, there was the family called the Maccabees, and the oldest member of the family saw a Jewish man about to offer an offering to one of the Roman gods, and he killed that man. And then he and his sons fled into the caves north of Jerusalem, and they began to organize a revolution against the Roman Syrian rule. And one of his sons was named Judah. He was called Judah Maccabee, and it's thought that means Judah the hammer. And he was a very good organizer, and the family did that. And their father, Mattathias, who was a priest, said that if they were going to be effective, that they should be allowed to fight on the Sabbath, which would never have been allowed before. But they said, if we're going to survive, we can't take a day off. And ultimately, with this kind of guerrilla warfare, even though they were outmanned and definitely did not have the weapons that the Roman Syrians had, including elephants, they were victorious. And I think they were surprised, but but when they got to Jerusalem, they saw that the temple that was there had been desecrated. And in every Jewish temple, there's always a light that is kept burning. It's a symbol of God's presence. And there was a little bit of olive oil left in that light. And of course, they cleaned the temple up, and they went searching for more oil to keep the synagogue, that eternal flame always going. But the land had been devastated by the war, and it was very hard to find that oil, and it took 8 days. But nevertheless, the small amount that had been in the original light that was there was still burning, and that was considered a miracle. And so that is why we celebrate for 8 days. And I guess some people have wondered why we don't just light 8 candles every night, but we don't. We light 1 and then 2 and then 3 until at the end of the holiday, all 8 are lit. And the idea is that you increase your holiness as you add. And the word Hanukkah itself means rededication, and it meant the rededication of the temple and the purification of it after having pigs slaughtered in it and being used as a stable. So that's why Hanukkah. And then your question, Katie, of what do we do on Hanukkah? Well, we light these, which I think I showed you. And when we do that, we say 2 blessings. The first day we say a 3rd blessing. And we eat, if your tradition is coming from Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, you will eat potato and onion pancakes with sour cream and applesauce, and sing. And you may play with these sort of tops called Dreidels, a game that's somewhat of a gambling game. There's 4 letters on this. They stand for the words, a great miracle happened here. And with 1 letter, if you land on this one, you get everything that's in the pile, which could be chocolate kisses, could be pennies, could be nuts, whatever. And it was said that when the Roman soldiers were trying to find the guerrilla fighters, the guerrillas would hide their weapons and take out these things and pretend they were gambling. And, that's what they appeared this group of men to be doing. And that was a way of hiding. We sing songs. And when I was a child, I don't know if it was you, Katie, or Carolyn, who was asking me if we got presents, because it often happens that Hanukkah is celebrated in December. It might actually start in November, because again, it's based on the lunar calendar. But when I was a kid, my parents were both refugees. So one was born in a tiny village in the Ukraine, and my father was born in Germany. And my mom came in the late 20s and my dad in the late 30s. And when I was little, we didn't get presents because that had not been their tradition in Europe. But then it was the 50s in this country, and they looked around and we looked around, and pretty soon we were getting presents. And that's what we do with our kids as well. But it's nice, and that they really love it. And that's a part of our tradition. I will say with my own family that when our oldest daughter went to college, we we stopped celebrating Hanukkah at its usual time when we said, it's not really Hanukkah unless she's here. And then as each of them gone. So it turned out that we were always celebrating Hanukkah when the kids came home from school for, winter break. So, and the same is now true with their grandchildren. So when we celebrate as a family, we wait till it's winter break, and that's when we celebrate. So there's a lot of different families may have different traditions. So if anybody who's watching, who's from our community, and I see there are a couple of folks and they have other Hanukkah traditions, please feel free to fill in. And also, as I mentioned, a number of people in the community are blended families. So, they have to decide individually whether they want to celebrate Hanukkah and Christmas, blend them somehow, and that's each one. And I brought a number of slides, if I hope you're interested to see, that sort of show some Hanukkah menorahs and things over the years, starting with really old ones. I mentioned every synagogue having an eternal light. So that's, there's a picture of one of those in here. And also a menorah. There's another type of menorah that has, a menorah is the candle holder. It has 6 candles with the 7th. And that's something that in the book of Exodus, there's a portable synagogue, which the Jews carried through the desert between Egypt and Israel. And one of the things that God asked them to make for this portable synagogue was a candle holder with 6 stars on the 7th. So that you will see, that's now the symbol of the country of Israel. And we'll see it in the slideshow. So it's exactly like a Hanukkah menorah, but it has two fewer candles. And the other symbol that you'll see throughout is a lion. And that's because the symbol of the tribe of Judah was the lion. And they also called Judah Maccabee, also another name for him besides the hammer was the Lion of Judah. So anyway, you'll see those as we go through the slides. And if Carolyn is able, we'll start. This is an eternal light. It's a star-shaped one. It's from the 14th century in Germany, but it's so rough looking you could imagine that a similar one would have looked this way in the ancient temple in Jerusalem as well. Okay. This is a really ancient oil lamp, but we don't know how old it is. My dad found it when he was on an archaeological expedition in 1961 in the Sinai. But, we don't know how old it is. But that's an example of a very ancient oil lamp. Okay. This is one that was formed after Hanukkah started being celebrated. And this has, as you can see, the four on each side and the center one. And it held olive oil. And that's one of the first menorahs. And it's that we have a record of, and it's from the 4th or 5th century in Israel. And it's obviously clay. Okay, next, please. This is from the Arch of Titus. This is an arch that's in Rome, and it's right next to the Colosseum. And it shows, it's a victory arch for Titus, who was the son of Vespasian, and he basically conquered Israel about 200 years after Judah Maccabee, and that Jerusalem was completely razed. the people were almost completely dispersed to other countries. And this was in this Victory Arch, you see them bringing back the menorah from the temple in Jerusalem. People went from Israel, were brought mostly as slaves to Europe at that point, and eventually went from England to Eastern Europe. And some went to North Africa and into Africa as far as Ethiopia and Uganda. Some went to India. Some went into the Arab countries, or what are now Arab countries, Algeria, Morocco, Yemen. But the majority came to Europe, and some Jews remained in Israel throughout all of this, but the land was completely devastated by this. That's what's commemorated in this arch. That was in 70 Common Era, so that's really, it's like 200 years after Hanukkah. Okay. This is also from Italy, from the 1st to 3rd century. It's a marble burial plaque. So Jews had already, were there as slaves, but they were using this symbol from the synagogue in the cemetery. Okay. This is, you can see, is still using clay. This is from Avignon, France, from the 11th century. That's the Hanukkah Menorah. Okay. This one is from the 17th century. It's Italian brass menorah. Pretty simple, but you started seeing them using newer materials. Okay. This is becoming more ornate, and I can't enlarge it, but the feet of this menorah are 3 lions, or maybe there are 4 lions, I can't tell. This is also 17th century Italian. Okay. And this one, which again, it can't be enlarged, but it's covered with animals, and I don't know if you can see it on the bottom shelf, holding up the next shelf, are 2 elephants, and there are also birds and lions. And Carolyn noticed last night, which I couldn't see, but there's 2 palm trees on the very top next to some winged creatures. So that is from, I think that's also from, that's maybe 19th century Eastern European. Okay. This is a real simple one. This is from 1830 Germany, and it's just the 2 lions that are winged with an eternal light between them. Okay. This one is from Baghdad from the 18th century, and it has a very different look. As you can see, the hands that's supposed to be the hand of God to ward off the evil eye. And you will also see crescents and birds and stars, which are clearly influenced by the lands that they're living in. And can we see the next one? This is also from the same time in Baghdad. Now, my daughter-in-law, her family is from Baghdad. The whole community was essentially airlifted to Israel in the 1950s. And I asked her what her traditions were, and she said they didn't really continue traditions from Iraq in Israel, except that every night her grandfather's home was opened and the family would come over to light candles together. And there they had jelly donuts, which is actually an Israeli custom. And I asked her what other Israeli customs there were around Hanukkah, and she said, the schools were closed for the 8 days, and there were all kinds of cultural events for children, like plays and music contests. And up in the hills of Modin, where the Maccabees came from, there were always races. And so that was the way how the holiday was celebrated there. Okay. These are 4 different menorahs from North Africa The one on the far right with the orange is from Algeria. The others are from Morocco, and they're from the 18th to the 20th centuries. Okay. This is a very modern American menorah from about 1990. And that was one of the very modern ones that you could actually recognize what it was. So I wanted to include that. And then could we see the next one, please? This is from 1958, even though it looks really kind of ancient. It's in silver, and the silversmith wanted to recreate an Eastern European village. And so I have two more close-ups so you can see the kind of detail he went into in making this. Could you see the next one, please? This one, you can see the woman on the left has a platter for the potato latkes that she's distributing, and there's doves, which are another common motif in Jewish art, and children. And then in the next one, if Carolyn could show us, please. There you see a musician, a clarinetist, and a cellist, and children dancing, and again, more doves. And so that's all worked into that particular menorah. Okay, could I have the next one, please? These are different kinds of dreidels. Okay, next, please. Unless you think it's a very serious holiday, which it's not really. This is from my niece, who in her children's school had a menorah competition. And their menorah is a COVID menorah, so it features all the highly valued things during the epidemic, topped with candles. Okay, could I have the next one, please? These are my three of my youngest kids, and this is about 1983. Excuse me. Sorry?
I said, so cute.
Thank you. This is about 1983, and the Bainbridge Review was doing a story about Hanukkah, and so they came over. It's our dining room, and the one in the middle is now 41, and she's here with her toddler, whose name is Judah. So we're celebrating Hanukkah with him. Anyway, could I have the next one, please? This is my son's home in Portland, and his wife again, it's blended traditions, because on the right are potato latkes, and on the left is hummus from Israel, and some other foods which I don't recognize from Israel. But their menorah, the first one my son bought before his first child was born, is bumblebees, and that's what those yellow circles are, the bumblebees. And can I see the next one, please? These are my grandkids in Portland lighting the menorah. And I have the next one, please. That's their three menorahs, and one is on a computer, and the bumblebees are in the middle, and on the side is a Middle Eastern village, and it's a really fun one. So I'm going to hold one off, if you don't mind, Carolyn, and I'll finish with the last one in a minute. As I was doing this, I got to sort of wondering myself, again, because this was a military victory, why was it celebrated over all these years? Because it really is not considered a major holiday, but it is one that's been celebrated for all these years. And I think one of the things that I guess you have to consider is that it's a difficult history. And so even while the Jews were in the land of Israel, they were constantly having to battle to stay there. And several times, including something called the Babylonian exile, most of them were taken to Babylon for almost 60 years before they were allowed to return. And each time they would return, their homes had been, torn down, and the land changed. And it was constantly under different control, as I mentioned before. And then after people were brought to Rome, they lived in Europe for many, many centuries, but it was a precarious life. Sometimes there were periods of calm and feeling of comfort and that this is a place we can be. But particularly during the Middle Ages and the years of the plague in Europe, it was very uncomfortable for them because people thought that they were the cause of the plague. And so they were constantly having to move and relocate. So I think when you see Hanukkah, you see a story of people who were brave, who stood up for themselves and were successful. And it's a time of light. And I think the winters, particularly in Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews ended up living in Europe, was very cold and dark. And I think the light and the story gave people some comfort and a sense of hope about their future. And I noticed that in talking to several friends, their children who've grown up and are living in isolation during COVID, this year, unlike maybe some other years, they're lighting the menorahs because it's bringing them that comfort and putting them in touch with that. And Carolyn, I wonder if you might show the last slide. I got this from my cousins in San Francisco. And as you can see, be brave, stay strong, live your values, and may the courage and strength of the Maccabees and the light from their oil fill your home and heart. And actually, it felt like a very fitting wish. It's both a Hanukkah wish and a COVID wish, and I think a wish that many of us can take to heart because, you know, all of us have had to contend with a lot of difficulty and darkness. So anyway, thank you for inviting me to share about Hanukkah, and I have to answer any questions if you have them, or have my friends who are here answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon. That was amazing to see all the variations. And, you know, what popped to mind for me is the education that many of us are trying to get around African American history. And, you know, when we talk about the Japanese American exclusion, we like to say, you know, talk about also the resistance, because sometimes the stories are not inclusive of what can be considered a win, and just like you said, the courage, you know, and the resilience and the light that each different culture has.